Imagine standing on the edge of an ancient plain 74,000 years ago, where small bands of early humans moved through tall grasses under an ordinary sky. They hunted, gathered roots, and watched their children play near streams, the same rhythms that had shaped life for countless generations before them. Tension lingered in the air like an unspoken warning, as if the world itself held its breath. Far across the ocean, beneath what we now call Sumatra, the Toba supervolcano stirred. Its slopes had rumbled quietly for centuries, but now pressure built deep underground, sending faint tremors through the earth that few would ever connect to the darkening horizon ahead. Ash began to rise in thin plumes at first, catching the light in strange hues before the true force unleashed itself in a single, unimaginable breath that turned the sky grey and heavy across entire continents. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether a quiet room under city lights or a distant countryside wrapped in darkness, I'd love for you to share in the comments your location, the hour, anything that connects us across miles and moments. The eruption's ash spread like an invisible veil, cooling the air and dimming the sun for years to come. Yet in that ordinary morning no one could have guessed how near the edge everything stood, how close our entire human story came to ending in silence, leaving only the faintest trace of survivors to carry forward what remained. The rivers still flowed, the winds still carried seeds, but beneath the gathering clouds lay the quiet question of whether those small groups would endure or fade into the same soil that had held every life before them. Long before any written memory, the world stretched wide under skies that shifted with the seasons, yet held a steady rhythm for those who walked its paths. Early humans moved in small bands across continents that felt endless, their footprints tracing routes through African savannas where acacia trees dotted the horizon and herds of antelope crossed open ground at dawn. Some groups had already ventured northward, following coastal routes into the Levant and onward toward the edges of what would later become Europe and Asia, while others remained deeper in the southern reaches of their ancestral lands. These movements were never grand migrations but quiet drifts, shaped by the need for water and game, with each generation carrying forward the same knowledge of edible plants and safe shelters passed from parent to child. Daily existence unfolded in patterns that blended effort and stillness. People crafted stone tools by striking flakes from cores of flint or obsidian, shaping points that could pierce hide or carve wood for spears. They gathered tubers and seeds along riverbanks, roasted meat over small fires that crackled through the night, and wove simple coverings from bark or animal skins to guard against cooler winds. Children learned to watch for tracks in the dust, to listen for the rustle of predators in the undergrowth, and to stay close when storms rolled across the plains. Survival meant reading the land with patience, knowing which berries ripened after rain, which caves offered protection from flash floods, which paths avoided the territories of larger carnivores. Resources could grow scarce in dry spells, forcing bands to travel farther or share what little they found, yet the same cycles repeated year after year, allowing knowledge to accumulate slowly across lifetimes that rarely stretched beyond 3 or 4 decades. The challenges were constant yet familiar. Sudden changes in weather that withered plants or drove game away, illnesses that swept through groups without warning, and the ever-present need to balance movement with rest, so that the young and the elders could keep pace. These early people carried few possessions beyond what hands and backs could manage, yet they possessed a deep attunement to their surroundings, noticing the subtle signs of shifting seasons or the approach of strangers from distant bands. In this way, life continued across scattered populations that together numbered perhaps only tens of thousands, spread thin over vast distances, but linked by occasional meetings at reliable water sources where stories and tools were exchanged. Far to the east, across the warm waters that separated landmasses, lay an island chain where dense forests climbed volcanic slopes and rivers cut through fertile valleys. Among these features stood a broad lake nestled in the highlands of what is now Sumatra, its surface calm and ringed by thick vegetation that sheltered birds and small mammals. The water appeared ordinary to any who passed nearby, reflecting the sky in shades of blue or grey depending on the clouds, with no visible sign of the immense forces resting far below its bed. Generations of local animals and plants had thrived around its shores, the lake serving as a quiet gathering point amid the green expanse, its presence woven into the landscape as one more steady element in a world of rivers, ridges, and seasonal rains. Nothing in the gentle lapping of its waves or the steady growth of surrounding trees hinted at the pressure accumulating in hidden chambers beneath, leaving the scene to continue in unbroken peace for those who might have paused to drink or rest along its edges. The lake and its setting belonged to the same ancient continuity as the olive groves of later Mediterranean hills or the enduring rivers that still reach the sea today, indifferent to the brief spans of human lives unfolding around them. The lake had held its quiet for longer than memory could reach, yet beneath its calm surface the ground began to stir in ways no living thing had known. Subtle tremors first reached the surface, faint shivers that sent ripples across the water and caused the surrounding trees to sway without wind. Animals that drank at the shore lifted their heads, sensing a deeper unrest, while the birds that nested in the canopy fell silent, as if listening to something older than their own calls. These were the first hints that pressure long contained was finding its way upward, small fractures opening in the rock far below and allowing heated gases to seep through, turning the lake's edges warmer and stirring faint mists that clung to the dawn light. Over days or perhaps weeks the signs grew more insistent. Steam rose in thicker plumes from cracks that widened along the lake's rim, carrying with them the sharp scent of minerals drawn from depths no human foot had ever touched. The water itself changed, its usual blue-grey turning clouded as fine particles rose from below, and the once steady rhythm of waves gave way to occasional bursts that sent small waves lapping against the banks. Those who might have passed through the highlands would have noticed the ground warm beneath their feet, a low continuous hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than from any storm overhead. Yet the forest still stood, the rivers still flowed, and the ordinary patterns of growth and decay continued around this awakening giant, as if the land were preparing itself without haste. Then the mountain that cradled the lake could no longer contain what lay beneath. A series of violent blasts tore through the surface, hurling columns of ash and steam thousands of feet into the sky in rapid succession. What had been a broad, serene highland lake became the centre of an unfolding cataclysm, as the earth split and the pressure released in a single sustained roar that rolled across the island chain and beyond. The Toba supereruption unfolded on a scale that dwarfed any ordinary volcano, its caldera forming as vast underground chambers emptied in hours rather than days, ejecting perhaps 2,800 cubic kilometres of rock, ash and pumice into the atmosphere. The initial plume rose so high that it pierced the stratosphere, spreading outward in a dark veil that caught the winds and began its long journey across oceans and continents. Within the first hours, the devastation was absolute for everything near the source. Pyroclastic flows surged down the slopes, rivers of superheated gas and fragments that incinerated forests and buried valleys under layers of glowing debris many meters thick. For hundreds of miles in every direction the air grew thick with falling ash that blotted out the sun, turning midday into an ashen twilight where even the strongest trees bent and snapped under the accumulating weight. Rivers choked with sediment, their courses altered as mud flows carried the mountain's remnants toward the sea. The immediate zone of destruction stretched across thousands of square miles, leaving a landscape reshaped in fire and stone, while the finer particles continued to rise and spread, carried by upper winds that knew no borders. Farther out the ash fell more gently yet still in volumes that transformed the world. Over the following days a pall drifted across the Indian Ocean and into the heart of what would later be Asia and Africa, depositing layers that in some places reached several meters deep, and in others formed a thin but persistent dusting that altered the colour of the sky itself. The sheer quantity of material suspended aloft, enough to circle the globe and linger for years, meant that sunlight reaching the surface was scattered and dimmed, though the full consequences of that veil would unfold only gradually. The eruption's energy rivaled the largest events in Earth's long record, its force released not in a single moment, but in a sustained outpouring that left the island chain forever altered and sent echoes through the atmosphere that would be felt in temperature shifts and weather patterns across hemispheres. In the quiet that followed the initial blasts, the lake basin had become a vast, steaming depression, ringed by new cliffs of freshly exposed rock. The surrounding slopes lay stripped of vegetation, their former green replaced by grey mantles that would take generations to soften. Yet even in that moment of upheaval, the ancient continuity persisted. The rivers still sought the sea, the winds still carried what they could, and the land began the slow work of settling into its new form. Those early bands living thousands of miles away would have seen only an unusual haze on the horizon, or felt a faint coating of dust on their tools and skin, unaware that the sky itself had been rewritten in ways that would test every living thing's capacity to endure. The eruption had begun, and with it the world entered a different chapter, one whose full measure would be read only in the long silence that followed. The ash that rose from the caldera did not settle quickly. Instead, it lingered in the upper air, carried by currents that had circled the planet long before any foot touched its surface, spreading a fine veil that thinned the light reaching the ground. What had begun as a distant haze on the horizon thickened into a persistent dimming, scattering rays that once warmed open plains and forest clearings alike. Gases released alongside the rock fragments, sulfur compounds that rose high enough to join the stratosphere, mingled with the dust and formed a layer that reflected back a portion of the sun's energy, leaving the surface cooler by several degrees across wide regions. In places the change arrived within weeks, elsewhere the cooling crept in more slowly, yet the result was the same: summers that never quite arrived, and winters that stretched beyond their usual bounds. Over the seasons that followed, the altered light brought disorder to weather patterns that had once followed familiar rhythms. Rainfall became unpredictable, sometimes arriving in sudden downpours that washed away thin soils, at other times withholding moisture for months on end. Temperature swings grew sharper between day and night, while entire regions that had known steady warmth found themselves under unexpected frosts. These shifts did not announce themselves with sudden catastrophe, but unfolded as a gradual tightening of conditions year after year, testing the endurance of every living thing that depended on the steady return of warmth and growth. Some years the veil thinned enough for brief respites, only to thicken again when fresh winds stirred the remaining particles aloft. Plants felt the absence first. Forests that had stood dense and green began to thin at their edges as reduced sunlight slowed photosynthesis, leaving leaves smaller and less abundant. Grasses that once covered open ground turned patchy, their roots struggling against colder soils that held less moisture. In higher latitudes, the growing season shortened to a fraction of its former length, so that seeds ripened late or not at all. Across the tropics, the change was subtler yet still felt. Flowering cycles lost their timing, and the steady green canopy grew sparser, where light no longer reached the understory in sufficient strength. What had been reliable cycles of leaf and fruit became uncertain intervals, with entire groves standing bare through seasons that once would have clothed them fully. Animals that relied on those plants found their own patterns disrupted. Herds that moved with the seasons encountered grasslands no longer sufficient to sustain them, forcing longer migrations across terrain that offered little shelter from the colder nights. Smaller creatures that fed on seeds and insects discovered their food sources diminished, so that populations that had once been plentiful grew thin. Predators higher in the chain felt the shortage next, their usual prey harder to find and weaker when caught. In the oceans, the same dimming reached the surface waters, slowing the growth of plankton that formed the base of marine life, so that fish schools thinned and the creatures that hunted them ranged farther for fewer returns. The quiet that settled over these landscapes was not the stillness of peace, but the hush of systems adjusting to less energy, flowing through every level of the web. Familiar places transformed under this sustained cooling. Valleys that had once held clear streams and open meadows now lay under drifts of snow that lingered well into what should have been spring. Hillsides once dotted with flowering shrubs stood grey and brittle, their branches coated in frost that cracked with each wind. Rivers that had flowed steadily narrowed or froze along their banks, their beds marked by ice that broke only during brief thaws. What had been open savanna hardened into frozen ground where only the hardiest roots survived beneath the surface. Even in regions far from the eruption's source, the memory of warmth became something held in the soil rather than felt in the air, so that the land itself seemed to withdraw into a quieter, slower state, while the veil overhead persisted. Yet within this altered world the older rhythms did not vanish entirely. Rivers still sought the sea, carving new paths when ice altered their courses. Seeds that had lain dormant through colder intervals waited beneath the frost, ready to stir if light and warmth returned even briefly. Small bands of living things found pockets where conditions remained less severe, sheltered valleys or coastal strips where the veil's effect was softened by proximity to water. These refuges did not erase the broader strain. but they preserved threads of continuity amid the widespread retreat. The cooling lasted not for a single season, but for years, perhaps a decade or more, its duration shaped by how long the suspended particles and gases remained aloft before rain, and settling finally cleared the sky. When the light finally strengthened again, the landscapes that emerged were changed in ways both subtle and lasting, their plant and animal communities rearranged by the long interval of scarcity. The possibility that such a veil could reduce human numbers to a narrow thread rests on these same global effects, though the exact reach of the hardship remains open to interpretation. What is clearer is that the world after the eruption was one in which survival depended on finding those scattered places where the cold and the dark pressed less heavily, allowing the small groups that endured to carry forward the thread of their kind into the warmer centuries ahead. In the quiet stretches that followed the long veil of ash and cooling, the scattered groups that found shelter in those pockets of milder ground carried forward a thread of life that had grown perilously thin. Across the continents, the signs of that narrowing appear not in the stones or the layers of dust, but in the patterns held within living cells, where the record of ancestry reveals stretches of surprising uniformity. Researchers examining the genomes of people today notice how certain segments of DNA show far less variation than would be expected if human populations had always remained large and widely scattered. This reduced diversity hints at a time when the total number of individuals passing on their traits shrank dramatically, leaving fewer lineages to branch outward in the generations that came after. The evidence emerges gradually through comparisons of mitochondrial sequences and Y chromosome markers, each one mapping back to a handful of common ancestors rather than the broad array that might have existed in earlier eras of abundance. A genetic bottleneck forms when external pressures cut through a once thriving population, trimming it to a small surviving core whose descendants inherit only the limited set of variations those survivors carried. In the aftermath, the signatures appear as long runs of identical genetic code across many individuals, fewer mutations accumulating over time, and an overall drop in the number of distinct alleles that code for traits from disease resistance to physical features. These patterns do not arise from any single dramatic event alone, but from the way small groups, isolated by distance and hardship, interbreed within narrow circles for many generations, before numbers recover enough to allow wider mixing. The process leaves the collective human heritage with echoes of that constriction, visible today in the way global populations still cluster around a relatively modest set of foundational lineages, despite the vast spread of humanity across continents. Estimates drawn from these genetic traces suggest that the number of breeding individuals may have dipped as low as a few thousand, perhaps between 1,000 and 10,000 at the narrowest point, though such figures remain approximations shaped by models that account for migration rates, mutation clocks, and the uneven preservation of ancient DNA. Some calculations place the effective population size even lower for brief intervals, while others allow for somewhat larger clusters sustained in favourable refuges. The range reflects the uncertainties inherent in reading backward from modern samples to events tens of thousands of years distant. What lingers across these varying projections is the sense that humanity passed through a period when its total presence on the planet stood far closer to the edge of disappearance than at any later stage of recorded history. The survivors, wherever they gathered, held within their small bands the entire future diversity of our species, each generation rebuilding slowly from that slender base. The timing of these genetic patterns aligns closely with the period surrounding the Great Eruption at Toba, when the atmospheric veil and the years of altered climate would have placed exactly the kind of sustained pressure capable of producing such a constriction. Layers of volcanic material dated to roughly 74,000 years ago coincide with the window in which the diversity drop appears in the molecular clocks, offering a plausible link between the global cooling described in the altered seasons and the demographic narrowing preserved in our genes. Yet the connection stays one of correspondence rather than proof, for other factors such as regional droughts or shifts in available game could have contributed to the same outcome, and the precise duration of the bottleneck continues to invite refinement as new samples and analytical methods emerge. In this way, the theory opens a window onto possibility, that the same forces which rearranged forests and thinned herds also compressed the human story into a few resilient threads, carried forward by those who found the sheltered valleys and coastal margins where the cold pressed less harshly. From those reduced numbers, the later expansion of humanity unfolded with a genetic signature that still bears the imprint of that earlier scarcity. When populations began to grow again and move outward, the variations they carried were already filtered through the survivors' limited pool, so that even as groups spread across Africa, Eurasia, and eventually beyond, the underlying architecture of their DNA retained stretches of shared heritage from that critical interval. This does not diminish the richness of later adaptations, but rather frames them as outgrowths from a single narrow passage, where chance, endurance, and the quiet persistence of small bands determined which traits would seed the broader tree of human descent. The rivers continued to seek the sea, the soil held its dormant seeds, and within the living memory encoded in cells the story of that thin thread remained, waiting for later eyes to trace its outline across the long arc of recovery. In the quiet stretches that followed the long veil of ash and cooling, the scattered groups that found shelter in those pockets of milder ground carried forward a thread of life that had grown perilously thin. Across the continents, the signs of that narrowing appear not in the stones or the layers of dust, but in the patterns held within living cells, where the record of ancestry reveals stretches of surprising uniformity. Researchers examining the genomes of people today notice how certain segments of DNA show far less variation than would be expected if human populations had always remained large and widely scattered. This reduced diversity hints at a time when the total number of individuals passing on their traits shrank dramatically, leaving fewer lineages to branch outward in the generations that came after. The evidence emerges gradually through comparisons of mitochondrial sequences and Y chromosome markers, each one mapping back to a handful of common ancestors rather than the broad array that might have existed in earlier eras of abundance. A genetic bottleneck forms when external pressures cut through a once thriving population, trimming it to a small surviving core whose descendants inherit only the limited set of variations those survivors carried. In the aftermath, the signatures appear as long runs of identical genetic code across many individuals, fewer mutations accumulating over time, and an overall drop in the number of distinct alleles that code for traits from disease resistance to physical features. These patterns do not arise from any single dramatic event alone, but from the way small groups, isolated by distance and hardship, interbreed within narrow circles for many generations before numbers recover enough to allow wider mixing. The process leaves the collective human heritage with echoes of that constriction, visible today in the way global populations still cluster around a relatively modest set of foundational lineages, despite the vast spread of humanity across continents. Estimates drawn from these genetic traces suggest that the number of breeding individuals may have dipped as low as a few thousand, perhaps between 1,000 and 10,000 at the narrowest point, though such figures remain approximations shaped by models that account for migration rates, mutation clocks, and the uneven preservation of ancient DNA. Some calculations place the effective population size even lower for brief intervals, while others allow for somewhat larger clusters sustained in favourable refuges. The range reflects the uncertainties inherent in reading backward from modern samples to events tens of thousands of years distant. What lingers across these varying projections is the sense that humanity passed through a period when its total presence on the planet stood far closer to the edge of disappearance than at any later stage of recorded history. The survivors, wherever they gathered, held within their small bands the entire future diversity of our species, each generation rebuilding slowly from that slender base. The timing of these genetic patterns aligns closely with the period surrounding the Great Eruption at Toba, when the atmospheric veil and the years of altered climate would have placed exactly the kind of sustained pressure capable of producing such a constriction. Layers of volcanic material dated to roughly 74,000 years ago coincide with the window in which the diversity drop appears in the molecular clocks, offering a plausible link between the global cooling described in the altered seasons and the demographic narrowing preserved in our genes. Yet the connection stays one of correspondence rather than proof, for other factors such as regional droughts or shifts in available game could have contributed to the same outcome, and the precise duration of the bottleneck continues to invite refinement as new samples and analytical methods emerge. In this way, the theory opens a window onto possibility that the same forces which rearrange forests and thinned herds also compressed the human story into a few resilient threads, carried forward by those who found the sheltered valleys and coastal margins, where the cold pressed less harshly. From those reduced numbers, the later expansion of humanity unfolded with a genetic signature that still bears the imprint of that earlier scarcity. When populations began to grow again and move outward, the variations they carried were already filtered through the survivors' limited pool, so that even as groups spread across Africa, Eurasia, and eventually beyond, the underlying architecture of their DNA retained stretches of shared heritage from that critical interval. This does not diminish the richness of later adaptations, but rather frames them as outgrowths from a single narrow passage, where chance, endurance, and the quiet persistence of small bands determined which traits would seed the broader tree of human descent. The rivers continued to seek the sea, the soil held its dormant seeds, and within the living memory encoded in cells the story of that thin thread remained, waiting for later eyes to trace its outline across the long arc of recovery. Where those threads found their purchase, the landscape itself seems to have offered quiet invitation rather than outright resistance. Theories about the places of refuge turn often toward the southern and eastern reaches of Africa, where the vast continental interior might have turned brittle under the dimmed sun, yet the margins along the ocean kept a gentler rhythm. In those coastal stretches the air retained more moisture, the tides still brought their twice-daily gifts, and the rocky shores held pockets of life that did not depend on the failing rains or the retreating herds. One cannot point to any single valley or cove as the sole haven, for the evidence remains scattered and the models allow for many such pockets, some perhaps no larger than a few days' walk across, others linked by seasonal trails that small bands followed when the inland chill eased for a season. What draws attention is how the sea itself acted as a steady companion, its waters less affected by the volcanic veil overhead, its creatures still moving in rhythms older than any remembered winter. Along the southernmost edge of that continent, at places like Pinnacle Point, the cliffs rise above wave-cut platforms where generations might have paused to gather shellfish and kelp when other foods grew scarce. The caves there, carved into the limestone over countless ages, face the Indian Ocean and catch the warmth of currents that flow from warmer latitudes. Archaeological layers at these sites reveal tools fashioned from stone gathered nearby, hearths whose charcoal still speaks of repeated visits across centuries, and the remains of marine snails and mussels that would have provided reliable protein, even as grasslands withered farther inland. Similar traces appear at other coastal locations along the same shoreline, where the meeting of land and water created microclimates less touched by the global cooling. These spots did not promise abundance so much as continuity, a place where a band of perhaps 24 individuals could return year after year, teaching their children the tides and the safe routes along the rocks. The persistence of such small groups through years of hardship invites contemplation of how life unfolded in those refuges. With numbers so reduced, every individual carried weight in the daily round of foraging and watching. Children learned early the patterns of the shore, the best times to pry limpets from their holds, the signs that a storm might bring driftwood or stranded fish. Elders remembered the locations of freshwater seeps that still trickled, even when rivers upstream ran dry. In the evenings, within the shelter of a cave or beneath an overhang, stories might have been shared not for entertainment alone but to keep knowledge alive across the thin generations. The sea provided more than food. It offered a horizon that remained unchanged while the sky above stayed veiled, a reminder that some rhythms endured beyond the reach of ash and frost. Inland from these coasts, other pockets may have existed in sheltered valleys, where underground springs kept small groves alive, or where herds of resilient antelope still found grass in the rain shadows of hills. Across these possible refuges the groups did not remain entirely isolated. Occasional movement along the coast or through passes between highlands would have allowed limited exchange of mates and materials, enough to prevent complete stagnation, yet not so much as to erase the genetic signature of earlier constriction. The tools they left behind show continuity with earlier traditions, yet also subtle shifts toward greater reliance on coastal resources, as if necessity itself guided the hand. At Pinnacle Point and comparable sites, the layers accumulate slowly, each thin stratum marking another season of return rather than a sudden flourishing. This gradual presence suggests that survival was measured not in dramatic leaps, but in the patient repetition of small acts, collecting water in ostrich eggshells, repairing nets woven from local fibres, tending the fire that kept the night chill at bay. One can imagine how the coastline itself became a kind of living map for those who stayed. Headlands offered vantage points to watch for approaching weather or the movement of seals on offshore rocks. Bays sheltered from the prevailing winds became gathering places where several bands might meet briefly when conditions allowed. The very persistence of these locations across tens of thousands of years speaks to their reliability, as if the land remembered the people even when the wider world seemed to forget them. Theories continue to explore whether other coastal zones, farther north along the African shore or even around the margins of what is now the Red Sea, played similar roles, each one shaped by local currents and geology, yet united by the same principle that the sea could buffer the worst effects of atmospheric change. In every case, the scale remains intimate. A few families moving together, their footprints washing away with each tide, their presence recorded only in the quiet accumulation of shells and charcoal. Through such places the thread of human continuity found its way forward, carried not by any grand migration, but by the daily choice to remain where the cold pressed less harshly. The years of hardship stretched long enough that children born in the refuges grew to adulthood knowing no other world. Yet the knowledge of earlier abundance lingered in fragments of song or in the way certain stones were still favoured for tools. When the skies finally cleared and the seasons began to soften, these coastal bands held the numbers and the skills needed to move outward once more, carrying with them the limited yet sufficient variations that would seed later populations. The olive trees on distant hillsides, the rivers finding their paths regardless of empires, and the soil holding its seeds through every winter, all speak to the same quiet endurance that allowed those small gatherings to persist until the planet itself began to turn toward renewal. Yet even as those coastal margins and sheltered valleys cradled the slender threads of continuity, the story they seem to tell invites closer scrutiny, for the patterns etched in genes and scattered across ancient soils do not speak with a single voice. One might wander through the same landscapes where small bands once gathered shellfish or tended quiet fires, and notice how the very persistence of life raises quiet questions about whether any single narrowing could account for all that followed. The genetic uniformity observed today, those long stretches of shared code among distant populations, has prompted some researchers to wonder if the constriction arose not from one prolonged veil of ash, but from a series of more localized pressures, each trimming lineages in its own quiet way before the broader recovery began. Comparisons of whole genomes from present-day groups in parts of Asia and Oceania sometimes reveal pockets of variation that appear older than the proposed window around 74,000 years ago, suggesting that at least some ancestral lines escaped the most severe trimming and continued to accumulate mutations in relative isolation. Such findings do not erase the overall drop in diversity, but instead hint that the bottleneck, if it occurred, may have been patchier than a global winter alone would imply, with certain refuges sustaining larger or more connected groups than the narrowest models allow. Alternative explanations for the same genetic signatures turn attention toward processes that unfold more gradually, without requiring a sudden atmospheric catastrophe. Founder effects, for instance, arise whenever small bands venture into new territories and establish themselves with only a fraction of the original variation, a pattern that could accumulate across multiple waves of movement long after any volcanic event. Natural selection acting on particular traits during periods of resource scarcity might further reduce diversity by favouring a handful of successful alleles, leaving the rest to fade without any dramatic drop in total numbers. Demographic models that incorporate fluctuating birth rates and occasional isolation between neighbouring groups produce similar outcomes in the molecular record, showing how repeated local hardships could weave the same tapestry of uniformity without a single worldwide choke point. These possibilities do not contradict the evidence of reduced variation, but instead spread the explanation across many centuries of quiet attrition, where climate shifts, changes in prey availability, or even subtle shifts in social networks each played their part in shaping what survived in the living cells of later generations. Archaeological layers at sites far from the African coasts add further layers of complexity, revealing traces of human presence that seem to bridge the supposed interval of hardship with surprising continuity. In parts of India, stone tools and occupation debris appear in sequences that show little interruption across the time when ash from distant eruptions would have settled, suggesting that some populations maintained their ways of life with only modest adjustments rather than wholesale retreat. Similar patterns emerge in certain Australian and Southeast Asian contexts, where dating of hearths and tool scatters points to sustained activity even as global temperatures dipped, implying that whatever pressures acted on human numbers did not leave every region equally barren. These findings complicate any straightforward link between a single eruption and a uniform demographic collapse, for they indicate that the human presence on the landscape remained more resilient and widespread than the narrowest bottleneck scenarios predict. At the same time, the tools themselves often display subtle refinements in raw material choice or technique, as if necessity encouraged innovation without requiring a complete restart from a handful of survivors. Scientific interpretations of these threads diverge not in outright conflict, but in the weight each assigns to different strands of evidence, leaving the question open for ongoing refinement. Some analyses of ancient DNA samples emphasize the alignment between genetic clocks and the Toba ash layers, arguing that the scale of cooling would have been sufficient to push marginal populations past the edge of viability. Others, examining the same molecular data through different statistical lenses, highlight how migration rates and incomplete sampling of ancient genomes could inflate the apparent severity of any single constriction, proposing instead a mosaic of regional bottlenecks spread across tens of thousands of years. Archaeological teams working at inland sites sometimes report evidence of population stability that challenges the assumption of widespread abandonment, while geneticists studying living groups in equatorial zones note diversity levels that fit more comfortably with steady, if slow, continuity. No single framework claims to resolve every inconsistency, and the models continue to shift as new samples emerge from previously unsampled regions or as dating methods gain precision, each adjustment revealing how the human story during those millennia likely combined elements of both sudden stress and longer-term adaptation. In this landscape of measured disagreement, the rivers still trace their ancient courses through valleys that may have sheltered some bands while others moved on, and the soil continues to hold seeds that wait for conditions to ease. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the narrative, reminding us that the thread of descent we carry today emerged from possibilities rather than certainties, shaped by pressures whose exact balance remains open to fresh interpretation. As further genomes are sequenced and more sites are carefully excavated, the picture may grow clearer without ever settling into a single definitive account, allowing the quiet endurance of those earlier groups to stand alongside the broader forces that may have trimmed or scattered them. What persists across these differing views is the recognition that whatever combination of events unfolded, the resulting patterns in our shared heritage invite continued curiosity rather than final resolution, much as the olive trees on distant hillsides keep their patient rhythm regardless of which story later observers choose to emphasize. Yet as the centuries turned and the ash settled deeper into the earth, the restless winds began to carry less of winter's weight, allowing the sun's warmth to linger longer across the savannas and coastal plains. One might picture those gradual shifts as a quiet unwinding, where once chilled rivers swelled again with seasonal rains, and the thin grasses returned to cloak the hillsides that had stood bare under the veil. In sheltered pockets where small bands had endured, the same soils that held the memory of scarcity now yielded more reliable roots and seeds, inviting the careful hands of gatherers to linger a little longer each season. These changes unfolded not in sudden flourish, but through patient cycles, as if the planet itself were testing whether life could stretch once more without the press of constant uncertainty. From those modest refuges, human groups began to move outward again, following the recovering game trails and the reappearing watercourses that led toward higher ground or along forgotten shorelines. Perhaps a band that had once clustered near the edges of a mist-shrouded valley ventured farther inland when the browsing herds returned, carrying with them the same stone-working habits refined during harder times. Others traced the coastlines where shellfish beds had slowly re-established, their numbers growing by small increments, as children born into slightly steadier conditions carried forward the knowledge of seasonal routes. These movements were never a single tide, but a series of tentative steps, each generation testing the margins a little farther, drawn by the promise of new gathering grounds, yet always tethered to the memory of places that had once sustained them through the leanest years. In this spreading, the descendants of those earlier survivors found pathways that would later echo across continents. The same lineages that had held on through the narrowest passages carried their accumulated skills and subtle, genetic threads into regions north and east, where changing shorelines and open grasslands offered fresh opportunities. One can trace in the patterns of later tools and occupation sites how these expansions may have fed into the broader movements that eventually carried people beyond the African continent itself, following corridors that opened as climates warmed and deserts receded in places. The migrations that peopled distant lands centuries afterward thus appear as extensions of that slow rebound, each wave building upon the resilience already shaped by earlier constraints, though the exact routes and timings remain open to the quiet revisions that new finds continue to suggest. What lingers most is the sense of how delicately balanced such endurance proved to be. A few thousand individuals, perhaps scattered across several favourable corners of the landscape, held within their daily choices the entire future thread of our kind, their quiet persistence allowing the species to test again the possibilities of wider horizons. Yet that same narrowness reminds us of vulnerability, how readily shifting skies or dwindling resources could have closed those doors forever, leaving only the rivers to run and the trees to stand without human witness. The resilience we inherit today carries both legacies, the capacity to adapt through ingenuity and cooperation, and the awareness that our presence on this earth has always depended on conditions aligning just enough for small groups to endure and then reach outward once more. In the end, the olive groves and winding valleys continue their ancient rhythms, now shared with populations whose distant origins trace back to those same patient recoveries, inviting us to wonder at the slender chances that let the human story unfold into the world we recognize. In the quiet hours when one lingers over the slender chances that allowed our kind to continue, the central mystery of that long-ago day when the sky darkened and the world narrowed to a few scattered hearths comes into softer focus. We have followed the arc from the sudden shift in the air above distant mountains to the slow settling of ash across continents, through the years when the sun's light grew thin and the seasons lost their familiar rhythm. We have considered the possibility that a handful of bands, perhaps no more than a few thousand souls in total, found ways to endure in sheltered valleys and along recovering coastlines, their daily choices shaping the only thread that could lead forward. These explorations remain open to further discovery, for each new layer of sediment or trace of ancient tools may quietly adjust the picture without ever erasing the sense that survival itself was an improbable gift passed from one careful generation to the next. What stands clearest is how every person listening now carries forward the living consequence of those same narrow passages, the genetic patterns we inherit, the subtle variations that mark our shared ancestry, point back to that single period when the human presence on Earth balanced upon the resilience of small groups who refused to let the cold and scarcity close the story entirely. One might picture them moving through the recovering landscapes we touched upon earlier, carrying forward the same patient knowledge of roots and seasons until their descendants spread once more and the population began its long climb toward the numbers we recognize today. In this way, the existence of every listener, wherever these words find you, rests upon the same delicate thread of adaptation and quiet persistence that let a few thousand become the foundation for billions. If the reflections we have shared this evening have offered a measure of calm or curiosity, we would be grateful if you would consider liking this video, leaving a comment to share where you are listening from, and subscribing so that further journeys into these quiet corners of the past may reach you again. Viewers who enjoy the content can also support the channel in ways that help sustain these explorations for others who seek the same gentle company in the late hours. The olive trees and winding rivers continue their ancient courses, undisturbed by the names we give to empires or the dates we assign to turning points, yet beneath their steady presence lies the memory of how close the human story came to ending before it had truly begun. In that memory we find not only the weight of vulnerability, but also the enduring invitation to wonder at the ordinary acts of gathering, sheltering, and moving onward that allowed the thread to hold. Each breath we draw today connects us across the centuries to those who waited out the volcanic winter, their unknown faces now part of the single, unbroken lineage that stretches forward into whatever seasons lie ahead.